It is easily among the most heard criticisms about both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The enemy variety is lackluster. Hyrule may have never been as big and widely explorable as it is in these games, but it can definitely feel like no matter where you look, you see bokoblins, moblins, or maybe an Octorok if you're lucky. But it did make me wonder, is this actually true? Do the two open world Zeldas truly have bad enemy variety when compared to other games in the series? Or is this all in our head and based on different factors perhaps? That's what I wanted to find out, and after some in-depth analysis, I have come to some very clear conclusions and managed to figure out where exactly these problems come from. But first we need to look at the facts and the numbers. How many enemies are actually in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom? Well, that is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. After all, are the wolves that can attack you to be considered enemies? And what about the bosses that can be found in the overworld? Because I didn't want to spend this entire video talking about asterisks and borderline cases, I've decided that the easiest way to tackle this problem, not just for the open world games, but for every Zelda game we're going to be discussing today, is to make the number of enemies stated an indication and not a cold hard number. The amount of debatable cases are never so large that they truly warp the numbers, so no matter whether you consider the Hinox an enemy or not, the number I use is similar to the number you would end up on if you were to repeat my research. Alright, with that out of the way, let's crunch some numbers. We'll begin by looking at individual enemies. Individual here means that this enemy is different in some way from every other enemy in the game, but it might fall into the same category as another. For example, a black bokoblin and a regular bokoblin count separately here. Through this lens, Breath of the Wild has around 75 different enemies, while Tears of the Kingdom ups this number ever so slightly and has around 85 different enemies. New additions, for example, include 4 new Horriblins and 6 new Light-Lights, but Tears also lacks all 6 Guardian variants from its predecessor. Now, on the surface, this feels like a pretty high number, I would say, and if you would pull up comparable data from other games, that impression is actually confirmed. However, before we take a look at those, I feel like I must acknowledge that comparing the two open world titles to other Zelda games is incredibly difficult for obvious reasons. After all, there had previously never been a Zelda game that tried to do what these games do. So the context in which the enemies are presented is different from how it happens in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So I settled on using 5 different games as comparison material, in an effort to get a wider sense of all angles of the Zelda series in history. First we have the 2 Zelda games right before and after the open world titles, A Link Between Worlds and Echoes of Wisdom. However, since these are top-down games, they obviously have a completely different philosophy and design setup, so for that reason I also looked into Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess, the 2 prior 3D titles. And since I believe the Wind Waker is probably the closest thing we had to an open world Zelda before Breath of the Wild did it properly, that is also considered for comparisons. Alright, enough disclaimers, you came to see numbers, so numbers you'll get. Remember, Breath of the Wild was at around 75 individual enemies, while Tears of the Kingdom was at 85, which I suspected was on the higher end, which ended up being correct. The top-down games both have more, with Echoes of Wisdom around 95 and A Link Between Worlds at a whopping 120, but all 3D, camera behind your back titles lose out to the Switch games. Both Skyward Sword and The Wind Waker have only around 55 individual enemies, while Twilight Princess is around 80, which is more than Breath of the Wild, but not Tears of the Kingdom. Of course, there are a ton of different factors that play a role here, like I said before. There are no perfect comparisons to be made for the 2 open world games, but it is interesting that the numbers don't appear to reflect the feelings in the community. Looking at it from this perspective, you might be inclined to say that maybe our minds are playing tricks on us, and it might actually be the open world formula that causes this sense of enemy monotony instead of the diversity itself. After all, linear games can work into their formula that you only encounter certain enemies at the start of the game, while others are introduced later, which Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom don't really do, because there is no actual start of the game. Beyond the Great Plateau and the Great Sky Island, there is no set order to when you encounter enemies. Hell, you can go through the entire game and never encounter a certain enemy, which was almost impossible in past titles. That could definitely play a role in how you perceive the amount of enemies you encounter. However, there is one very important thing to highlight here. What we have so far looked at is individual enemies. Like I said, a Fire Keys and an Ice Keys are different enemies with different properties, so they're counted separately. However, to the vast majority of players, these two bats will feel like the same enemy. Same goes for the normal keys and the thunder keys. They all just fall under the same umbrella for most people, me included for the majority of these cases. So what we should really look at is the amount of categories of enemies. So I went back and did all that work again, now counting for different enemy types, which only made things more difficult, and me more happy I decided on using estimated numbers, because not every game is as clear with this as Echoes of Wisdom's level 1, 2 and 3 formula. But after some more crunching, I ended up with a number of around 13 different enemy categories for Breath of the Wild and 20 for Tears of the Kingdom. That then means that on average, every category in Breath of the Wild consists of 6 different variants, while that is around 4 for Tears of the Kingdom. And that is an important number because combined with the total number of individual enemies, it effectively creates what you can call enemy variety. Breath of the Wild has a very respectable 75 individual enemies, but with an average category size of 6, it's effectively only 13. Now, currently that sounds very low because we have only heard the individual enemy numbers for the other games, so I suggest we start taking a comb through their bestiaries as well. We already saw that the top-down titles had a significantly larger enemy count than 3D titles, and what's even more impressive is that they have high category numbers as well. A Link Between Worlds especially was very high with around 120 individual enemies, but it also has a category count of around a whopping 60. Mind you, that means A Link Between Worlds has more enemy categories than the Wind Waker and Skyward Sword have enemies total, all variants included. That's wild. It puts the spiritual successor to A Link to the Past at an average category size of 2, don't need a calculator for that, which is significantly lower than the open world games. And keep in mind, a low average category size is good, it means you don't repeat enemy design too often. But here it is, Echoes of Wisdom is even better. It also has around 60 categories, but only 95 individual enemies, which is an average category size of around 1.5. It is 4 times smaller than Breath of the Wild, which means that if that game wanted to feel as diverse as Echoes of Wisdom, it would need 4 times as many enemies. But okay, we already saw with the individual numbers that the top-down titles have significantly higher numbers all across the board, and that makes sense, because while I definitely don't mean to look down on these games, they're amazing, they're definitely less complex, which means including a high number of enemies is easier. But what about the other 3D titles? When looking at individual numbers, it appeared as if Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom weren't really outliers. Does that remain the case when looking at categories? Well, to give a short answer, no. And to give a long answer, Skyward Sword and the Wind Waker had a similar number of individual enemies, around 55, which is significantly less than the open world games, but when looking at categories, they both have more than the Switch titles. Both are around 30, with Skyward Sword probably having a little more than Wind Waker, but both have an average category size of around 2, which is interestingly enough very similar to the top-down games. They had nearly double the number of total individual enemies and categories, but the ratio is basically identical between all linear games. Because yes, Twilight Princess also hovers around that number. It has around 80 individual enemies and around 43 categories, so that's about 1.8 variants per category. Now, just to quickly paint the picture if the amount of numbers made you lose track, the average linear Zelda game, no matter whether it's top-down or 3D, has around 1 extra variant for every enemy. You have 1 keys, and then you have 1 elemental keys, again on average. Breath of the Wild has, again on average, 5 extra variants for every enemy. That's 1 normal keys, 1 fire keys, 1 ice keys, 1 electric keys, 1 dark keys, and another keys that doesn't even exist. This right here is a big problem. While there are in terms of individual, separate enemies a perfectly average number to be found in this version of Hyrule, there are way too many variants. Tears of the Kingdom already went in the right direction and managed to lower the average number of variants to 4, but that's still half the enemy variety we are used to. How to fix it is simple. Add more proper, brand new enemies and possibly lower the number of variants if it all ends up being a little too much. And you'll be around the series average in no time. But it does bring up another question for me, because there's no way Eiji Aonuma and his team didn't realize what I have just presented to you. Having the entire series holding a pretty steady number of average enemy total feels intentional. That feels like the sort of benchmark you make during the development of your game, to ensure there are enough to fill the game world with. So then why did they go away from that for the open world games? Or rather, was it really the open world games? I will die on the hill that The Wind Waker is an open world game. It just has a smaller world and almost accidentally became that instead of deliberately going for it. The point being, I don't think these games being open world is what caused the enemy variety to dip. It didn't for The Wind Waker, it didn't have to dip here. So what did cause it then? Well, I suspect the answer may be a core difference that has set Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom apart from not just every Zelda game, but also most other open world games from other developers. The focus on physics. Both titles, but Tears especially, take freedom to mean much more than just go where you want. It's how you want, do what you want. So many crazy different things are possible in these games, and that is a direct result of how much of a core part of the gameplay the physics are. It is, as Aonuma said himself in an interview, what the majority of the game's development time went to. And while that is partly because physics systems are notoriously difficult to polish, it also shows how important the team considered it to be. Physics affect everything. Every object in the world reacts according to the physics system, and that includes enemies. From that perspective, it's so much easier to just create a bunch of variants of the same enemy, since according to the physics system, they all behave the same. Black, silver, blue bokoblins, for the physics system they are identical. But the bokoblin, keys and Lizalfos, those aren't. I think that is a key reason why these two games have so little enemy variety, because the more enemy categories you introduce, the trickier you're making it to get your physics system balanced. And while they could have done that, the game was taking long enough to come out as is, same with Tears of the Kingdom. This theory is further supported by how other games with similar ideas had much larger enemy counts. I already mentioned The Wind Waker, which I would consider open world, yet that has the regular amount of variety, while Echoes of Wisdom takes a lot from the design philosophy of the two Switch games before it. One thing it didn't copy was an intense focus on physics. Freedom is still the name of the game, but it is used here in regards to puzzle solving and experimentation, which enemies really don't have anything to do with. But to conclude, not only have we found out that you are fully justified to feel like the two open world games on Switch have low enemy variety, because they factually do compared to the rest of the series, I feel confident in saying we have come to a pretty solid understanding as to why. What that bodes for the future is very hard to say though. If the next games continue the line of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I would expect steps akin to what Tears did compared to its predecessor, which would then bring the game about back in line with the rest of the series number-wise. However, if they decide that they're gonna do everything differently again, physics system included, we might find ourselves with another game with low enemy variety, provided it hasn't moved up on the list of priorities compared to Breath of the Wild. Is that a price you're willing to pay? Less enemies for a game with the same level of freedom and physics we got now? And how did you find the enemy variety of these games? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Zelda content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.